So hello everyone, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to CRU's first ever webinar, which is being presented as part of the Families for Inclusive Education project. If you haven't met me before, my name is Eliza and I work at CRU and manage the Families for Inclusive Education project. I'm also the mother of three, including the extraordinary young man Sean, who introduced me to the world of inclusive education and disability advocacy. The topic for today's webinar is very close to my heart because I know that at transition points, it's a time when families need to be very clear about what they want for their son or daughter. It's a time when they need to build their courage and vision. And it's also a time when they need to take a very intentional approach to planning to ensure that they can successfully navigate that transition point. Now, before I go on, I want to introduce you to some of my colleagues. Lindy Bringman is kind of hiding in the corner there, but will be joining us presenting towards the end of the webinar. In the room as well, we have Hugh Rosemiller and Jen Moritz, who I explained to those of you who joined earlier, will be collating some of the questions from the chat. And Fiona, who is sitting with me, who has actually participated in a webinar before, so it's the obvious choice to talk to you about some of the etiquette and technical aspects. Fiona.
Thank you. Hi everyone, welcome. I'm really pleased that you've been able to join us today. I just realised that some of you will have extensive knowledge about webinar and actively participated through either your studies or work, and that will have involved you using audio and visual, while others of you, this will be the very first time. So welcome, and I'm pleased you've been able to make it. I guess the most important thing initially is that we don't want, firstly, that you are being recorded. So you're not speaking, it's only us that are being recorded, but the webinar is being recorded. And that's why it's really important that you keep off your audio and video. If your audio is on, we will hear all of the background noises in your homes or wherever you are. So please make sure you leave those off. The chat section, which I've talked to you about, those who've been on for the last few minutes, if any of you are having difficulty finding that chat section, it is, you need to find the toolbar and you need to just move your mouse from the bottom up in the bottom of the screen, and the chat section will turn up there for you. It is through the chat section that we ask you to write all your questions down. Please, wherever possible, try not to make them too long, so simple, easy questions that we can obviously expand on when we talk about them. I also would like to remind you, in that toolbar is also the leave meeting section. So if you want to leave our meeting, please go in there, and that's how you sign out of the meeting. As we've said a few times, Jen's here collating all our questions, so please write them down as quickly as you can before you move along. If you do have the chance to have a pen and paper beside you, any notes to take while we're sharing this information, it's really important you record those down. If you leave the meeting, as I've just been asked, so you go to Jen at CRU Q&A, and that's her title. So if you need to talk directly, that's how we get those questions going. I've already talked to you about leaving meetings. If you have comment on the phone line, please email your questions to us, which has been highlighted to you before. There are many other areas of etiquette with regards to webinar, but they are usually associated when you've got the video and the audio on, and so I will not go into detail about those. But just finally, I just want to ask you to enjoy this webinar. Please provide us with feedback. At the end of this, we are going to send out a Survey Monkey questionnaire, so we definitely want to hear what you have to say, both what you've found have been the strengths of the webinar, as well as different ways we could possibly improve it. So enjoy, sit back, listen and learn, and I will be talking to you maybe later on in the question section.
Thanks, Fiona.
Thank you.
So we will also have the presentation available to you in the next day or so. Okay, so I'm assuming many of you will already know something of CRU. But CRU has been around for 30 years, and we exist to support people with disability to belong to and contribute to community life. We try to create the change that allows people to be at the heart of community rather than relegated to the margins. And for that reason, the Families for Inclusive Education project is a very good fit for CRU, because being included in school is such a important foundation really for the inclusive lives and the inclusive communities that we want to see into the future. So our project, if you don't know about it, has a number of different aspects. It's events like this webinar, workshops in 15 locations across Queensland. As I mentioned, for those who joined us early, there are also the opportunity for people to get travel subsidies to those workshops. We're producing case studies, web resources and newsletters. Importantly, we are able to provide individual consultations by phone, email or where practicable face-to-face. So I really encourage people who don't get their questions answered to take up that opportunity. And we will be working on establishing peer support networks across Queensland, because it's absolutely critical that families connect to each other to stay for the long haul in getting their son or daughter included. So this project is important because unfortunately school inclusion isn't still automatic. It requires a lot of commitment and focus by different parties, and I guess our focus in this project is really on the piece that families can play to make successful inclusion more likely. Oops. Okay, my clicker is not working. Okay, actually I've just skipped over. Okay, sorry about that. I guess I just want to quickly go through the overview of the session. So I want to talk, we are actually going to start very broad. We're going to talk about the things that are important for school inclusion generally, and then we're going to move to the more specific information about specific transition points. So we will be talking about entry into prep. We'll be talking about year-to-year transitions. We'll be talking about the transition into high school, and we'll also be talking about, I guess, a transfer to a new school, including transferring from a special setting into the regular setting. But the purpose is really to arm you with some ideas about what other families have found effective in opening up new conversations with schools. Ways to turn around a focus on deficits and problems to one of gifts and possibilities. We're really going to be talking about the role of families as decision makers and guardians of a vision for their family member. We'll be looking at the indicators for school inclusion, so really what should you be looking for? And we'll also be looking at the transition as really a process of building relationships to make inclusion successful. There's going to be about 50 minutes of content and then 10 minutes of questions. I know already that we probably won't get to everyone's questions, but if that's the case, we will be encouraging you to take up the opportunity for an individual consultation or phone or email us for further information. Okay, so let's look then at what are some of those foundational things we should be thinking about. So the first point is that we need to be clarifying your vision. Making sure that as family members, we always see our son and daughters with our family eyes, as they really are, of people of worth and value, not as the way the system might see them. And we'll talk about that a bit more. It's really important that you learn about inclusive education, what it should look like, what you're entitled to, what the legislation says, the evidence of what really works in inclusive settings. Because I guess if you're not clear about what inclusion should be and could be, then you risk accepting practices which are less than ideal, actually things that will not deliver the full benefits of an inclusive education. You may even find yourself as a parent arguing for things that sound good at the time but end up being to your son or daughter's detriment. So then we're going to also really be covering why it's important to take that very intentional and planned approach and work on documenting what you need. When I'm talking about planning, I guess I'm not thinking about something that requires an Excel spreadsheet, unless that's something that you're really into. It can be just jotting down your ideas in a notebook or even on the back of an envelope, but certainly you need to find a way to ground what's in your head, because I guess there are lots of assumptions that are made in schools about what the standard approach to students with a disability should be, and unless you're really clear about that, I guess your vision is less likely to come to fruition. So I guess in the planning as well, it's really important that you're, I guess, one step ahead of the game, really anticipating some of the challenges. For some people, they may be quite practical challenges, like, that the school has some, site accessibility issues. Perhaps you kind of know that your child may struggle to, move between classrooms, for example, or that, staff are going to need training in your child's communication. But very often families report that the barriers are actually much more attitudinal barriers. And so this is where, I guess, being prepared for common objections to inclusive education is really important. It can take the emotional sting out of those conversations when you're go and you hear, or I'm not sure that we'd have the resources for that, or oh look, inclusion really only works for kids when they don't require assistance with toileting. I don't think we could handle that. So certainly families tell us again and again that knowing what some of the common patterns are in those early conversations can really help them to be much more effective in standing their ground, to have a rehearsed response to some of those issues. So we're not going to go into those in detail, but we do have a lot of resources which help families to think about that. And importantly, I think perhaps the most important preparation you can do is at the level of your own belief. So I want to say up front, inclusion is for everyone. Children are already born belonging, and it's our role as family members to keep them belonging at the heart of community. So I've heard it said inclusion only works in the early years. I've heard it said inclusion only works for those who are kind of good enough to be included. I've heard it said that, maybe for kids who have been in a special setting, that it's too late for them to be included. You need to know it is never too late. All means all, and inclusion does not have an expiry date. So I'm just having some problems with the clicker. Okay. It's going to be a bit tricky actually with it not clicking, but anyway. Okay. So what is a vision? A vision is simply our hopes and dreams. It is a picture of an imagined future. And the clearer that we can be in seeing that imagined future, the more effective our advocacy around that vision will be. In my own life, I really could see that I experienced a failure of vision at the time I was seeking a high school for my son. It was actually really hard for me to imagine him going from the little primary school of 200 kids to any of the high schools that were on our shortlist. So even though I had put in the enrolment forms, I just was scared witless thinking about him going to high school. And another parent said to me, Well, can you imagine him kind of walking through the front gates in a school uniform? And I had to admit that I couldn't. So I then knew actually that was the first thing I needed to do. I needed to believe that it was possible for Sean to be in the high school that was actually theoretically our first choice. The other thing a vision does is it's a compass. It's really a filter for decision making where we're able to see, okay, if I go down this path, if I take this option, is that going to move us closer or further away from our vision? It helps to stay on track. It encourages us to have high expectations of what is possible. So it's not something like, I want my child to have a better pencil grip, or I want my child not to be relentlessly bullied. The big vision is that you want your child to be surrounded by love. You want your child to be successful as an independent learner. That's the big vision. And it allows us to act out of hope. A vision helps us find courage in scary places. And I think one of the reasons that transition is so fraught is because it really raises the threat of exclusion. I'm sure that many of you have experienced that feeling of dread of thinking, I have to make that phone call, and it may be that I'm going to get a really unwelcoming response when I call that school. So it's a time when old fears and doubts arise, and where we can start believing that inclusion is only for those who are good enough. So it's really important that we go back to our vision so that we're not demoralised and scared. And I think an effective vision provides a picture that can enlist others. So it's a way that supporters can be drawn into that vision with focus and energy, and become committed really to making a contribution to that child's vision. The other reason that vision really matters is because in the absence of a vision, we will get offered up the standard disability path, which is one of segregation, separateness, and low expectations. Really, we'll get the default path, not the good life that our sons and daughters deserve. And I guess one of the great benefits of my son now being 24 is I can see him doing so many of the things that other people told us were unrealistic. So he was successfully included through school, even though I was told that he couldn't be. He learned to read. He's made enduring friendships. He has 2 jobs in open employment. He's moved into his own home. He's attended TAFE and university, and they were all things that professionals told me over the years were not going to happen for him. So if I had let other people decide, what was possible for him, if I'd let other people dictate the vision for him, then it would have been special school, sheltered workshop, and a group home. So I guess once you have a vision, it's really important that we learn how to share that. And one way we can do that is really by writing it down into a profile or a 1-page document. So that's how you'd write it down. Also important, I think, in any transition documentation, that we take charge of the story that is told about our child, and that's kind of listing their strengths, their interests, who is important to them, what your priorities are, and what's the priorities for their kind of age and stage, and communicating how to bring out the best and what doesn't work. So I'm sure a few of you may have questions about kind of what does a vision look like. So I'm happy to share this vision from Dave and Deb for their daughter Ella. We believe Ella will live a life of purpose, filled with rich experiences, We envisaged our daughter in relationships that are genuine and meaningful. We see her gaining employment in the areas of her strengths and interests. Our expectations and hopes for a future are the same as for our son, to be content in what they choose to do and accepted for who they are. So this is a way really of capturing the big dreams for Ella's future. And then, as you can see, she had broken down other parts of other important information about Ella, which are probably a good counterpoint to all of the other reports that are likely to follow a child with a disability through their school years, which are probably much more likely to be focused on the gap in their skills or their challenges. So if you haven't got a document like this, I would really encourage you to take that on. So I didn't have anything as pretty as this when Sean was going through school, but I did have a document which listed his strengths and interests, and also I think my language was how to get the best out of Sean, which was a way of talking about some of the things that might be challenging for him, but in a very positive way. So visuals can play a really, I guess paint a picture that words sometimes can't. So this is an example that a parent, Sue, has done for her daughter Eliza, which I guess was meant to, Sue was worried really that the school may get distracted by the fact that Eliza had a rare syndrome, or that she kind of needed the wheelchair for mobility. And this was a way of saying, actually, Eliza is a kid who's just made for fun and adventure, who wants to be included, and actually, is already doing a lot of things that will be of benefit to, I guess, expanded on through the prep years. So I guess, can people see some of the pictures there that I guess will paint a very different picture of Eliza from what was likely to be there in her kind of paediatrician's report, for example. Here's another example, and this is of an older student. I just want to kind of, point out, probably because Ben is older, there's a little bit more specifics about what helps Ben to feel comfortable in class, like his visual timetable, the checklist, knowing how to get help and who to ask, for example. Also some more specific information about what engages Ben the most in learning. So we have a lot of other examples that we can send through to you if that would be of help. So, as well as vision, I guess we've started to talk about the importance of families taking charge of the story that is told about their child. And I've always found this this quote by Burton Blatt, a really eloquent warning of why that's important. So he writes, "We must be careful about the stories that we tell." So the old disability story is really one of tragedy, burden, and inferiority. And if we want our children to be welcomed, to be seen for who they are, and for others around them to have high expectations of what is possible, we need to tell a new story. So it's really critical that when we are approaching schools, that we're not just reinforcing old stereotypes or talking about problems that could kind of cloud people's ideas about who our child is. It's not to anyone's benefit to scare people witless about the disability, and we want to instead to be planting seeds of a kind of a positive nature. We need to be introducing our children well, so they can be seen for their strengths, and so people believe these are, someone who's worth investing in. Okay, because otherwise, why would anyone be excited about including our children? So I'm going to show you now a little video by my colleague featuring my colleague Lindy. There might be a little bit of a moment as we get that video up, but it talks to the issue of the power of a positive introduction.
When it came to enrolling Millie in school, my husband and I decided that we wanted her to attend the same school as her sister. We loved her and valued her as an important part of our family. We saw her as a beautiful individual who would grow up to do amazing things. We thought others would simply see her this way too, but it didn't happen that way. And then a big turning point for our family and our beautiful girl was when we attended a weekend for families who were wanting their loved ones with disability to be included in life. It was there that a wise mum of a young woman with disability shared a very personal story with me. The story was about when she was describing her daughter to a school staff member, and this teacher was actually decent enough to ask her, "Why are you describing your daughter that way?" listing her diagnoses and her deficits. "Your job is to tell me who she is, her strengths and her interests," which this mum shared actually brought her to tears. At that moment, I realised that when Millie had started school 6 years beforehand, I was able to describe her positively, talk about her strengths, her interests, the role she played. Now, after years of conversations about what she couldn't do, I was at a place where I found I was far quicker to automatically describe her in terms of deficits. And I think this was almost a defence mechanism, a way of beating others to it and protecting myself from being hurt. The impact that this had on Millie's self-concept was horrendous. At that family weekend, when we were doing the positive introduction activity, much to my embarrassment, it felt awkward, struggling to describe my daughter in terms of what she was good at, what she liked and enjoyed, the role she played. I have learnt that all the wishing in the world will not get people to see Millie for who she really is. It takes intention from me. It's unfair and it's wrong, but it's where our world is at the moment. I see it as my job to lead the way, to show others how she is to be spoken to and about. She's a gorgeous teenage girl. She's loved by her friends and her family. She contributes as much to those around her as they do to her. She is a yoga enthusiast. She is an amazing artist, like her dad and her siblings. She loves puzzles and craft. She wants to learn to drive, and she wants to find a job with animals or in science or robotics. She loves that kind of thing. I'm her mum, and it's my job to advocate for her and her vision for her future. When I do this job well, she gains confidence in exploring everything this amazing world has to offer and the contribution she is going to make to it. I'm excited to see what that contribution will be.
So it's a very moving description, and I think we can see how Lindy's description of Millie opened up different perceptions of her. And she also, I guess, it's a really nice segue into talking about what is the natural authority that we have as families and being able to embrace that to be stronger advocates. So this is the idea really that families are expected and best placed to make decisions for their young people. And we know our children the best for the longest period of time, and we will deal with the consequences well into the future when others disappear. So it's a quote from Margaret Ward, who says, list the people who've been constant in the life of your son and daughter. List all the people who've come and gone over the same period of time. Your first list will likely be short, naming your family members, perhaps a few faithful friends or extended family. these are the people who can even begin to claim some authority in your son or daughter's life. So as I was saying before, if I'd listened to all of the people who said my vision was unrealistic, my son's life could have ended up very differently. And it is our role as family members to embrace our authority as guardians of the vision. Okay, so I'm realising we're already running behind time, so I'm going to try and speed up here a little bit. But so we talked about in the beginning about the importance of knowing what inclusion should look like. And this definition is about, inclusion being about being physically present and fully participating in the same regular classroom as peers for the same proportion of time. And it's not just about being there, but it's about being socially belonging and immersed in the same curriculum. So it's not about a parallel experience. It's not about being only a visitor to the regular class. It is about being a full and valued member of that regular class. I talked about the fact that there's no prerequisite for being included. I think it's important for you to know that inclusion is consistent both with the state government policy on inclusive education. It's supported by state and federal anti-discrimination legislation, and it is a right upheld in the UN Convention for the Rights of People with Disability. This quote from a parent, Bianca, says this very eloquently. Liam's inclusion has never been about his development, academic ability, speech, behaviour or readiness. The only criterion that any child should have to meet is of being of school age. And knowing that can help us to stand our ground. So I think the reason this happens is actually the reason sometimes this idea about being good enough comes up is because we haven't fundamentally changed from a medical or deficit model to a social model understanding of disability. And here's a little video that reflects that. So the message of that video is a simple one, really, that we can design the world for everyone. We can design schools that accommodate diverse learners, and the challenge is how we do that. But it is a challenge, I guess, that the Queensland Department of Education is taking seriously. So their inclusive education policy states that students can attend their local school, that they should be able to access and participate in high quality education, be free from bullying and discrimination, and achieve academically and socially. So I would really encourage people to be very familiar with the department's own policy statements and their resources, and if you have trouble kind of accessing that, please let us know. Many families have found it helpful to know that the evidence in favour of inclusive education. And this is not kind of one or two studies, this is hundreds of studies over 50 years have found the benefits of a fully inclusive education. Importantly, some important aspects of that is the more the students are in the regular classroom, the more effective the education is. So sometimes we're led to believe that students need to be withdrawn from the regular classroom for one-on-one, and that's actually not consistent with the evidence. Or sometimes the idea that a unit is the best of both worlds. And again, this is a research about the benefits of a regular classroom for students, and that inclusion, even done poorly, is better than segregated education. So they're important aspects for you to be aware of. So obviously, when you're planning a transition, one of the key things is actually about choosing a school. So I'm going to get all of that up because the clicker is being a bit tricky. So asking these questions about where your child would go if they didn't have a disability, where your child has the most likelihood of being known in the local community, sometimes I guess choosing a school is a bit like choosing a home. It's about where you feel comfortable. Where do you think, and sometimes you can get a feel of the culture of the school when you're walking around. Talking to a lot of people can be very helpful, I guess, when you're choosing a school, but not also being aware that other people may have different priorities from you. So again, this is where you're planning, taking the time to write down what is important to you, what is your vision for your child, because no school will have everything you want. So you need to stay in the driver's seat as a decision maker. You know, if it's really important to you that your child has access to a music program or outdoor education, for example, they will be things that come into your decision making. I would say that if you're really, really confused and at a loss, asking yourself where your child would go if you didn't have a disability, or choosing the local school is probably really helpful. Okay, I would say it's really very difficult to make a decision based on a first conversation with the school. So I wouldn't be put off by a wary response at a school. Sometimes a very welcoming response can just be skin deep. Sometimes a discussion at the school office can be very dismissive, but I would persist because I guess I've found very often with, I've had that experience of going to the local kindy and the teacher looking just shocked initially. She had a look of fear in her eye, and she ended up being fabulous. So just worth going a bit deeper than that. But ideally, you're wanting people to see your child as a unique individual. Not, yep, we do autism here. You're wanting a sense that people have a flexibility and a willingness to kind of do what it takes. And really, I guess, an attitude of listening to you very carefully for who your child is and what they need. You're wanting sort of some sense of a culture of openness, flexibility, sort of a problem-solving approach, again, rather than a standard response. I would be really worried, actually, if in your first conversations you were getting almost like the plan for your child before they've listened to who your child really is. And sometimes it can be much easier if within the school community there's already signs of embracing diversity, not just disability, but a whole range of diversity, because probably they've built up that flexibility as a school community. And really you're wanting to look at what is the general culture of the school. So if you have a sense that this is only a school that values academic excellence, or it's only a school for jocks, then again you need to work out whether that's a good fit with your child. In some ways it can be easier. Sorry, and I am rushing through because I don't want to leave time for Lindy to do her bit. And I'm going to get her to come over now because I've got the last couple of slides. So some of the traps are, probably got this one already, going just where you're directed. Choosing a school with a higher proportion of students with a disability. And again, at that time and when I was doing the high school transition, I think I fell into the trap of thinking, where are we most likely to get a place, rather than what school was a good fit. So I was kind of going with kind of lower status schools with a higher proportion of students with a disability. And in the end, we ended up at a school that wasn't a good fit for that reason before we were able to move back. Choosing on the basis of resources and numbers of specialist staff. So really, more resources is not, resources are not a guarantee of inclusion done well. Putting too much emphasis on a key individual, because some of those key individuals can change. You're looking for the indicators of inclusion at the level of culture. Focusing only on the size of the school. So I think many parents tend to choose smaller schools thinking that'll be safer, but then that's a trade-off really against the opportunities that might be available in a bigger school. And certainly if you're going past your local school just to get to a smaller school, I think that would be something to wonder about. Going against your gut feelings and giving every opinion kind of equal weight. So I just do want to quickly go through some of the tips for the first conversations with school before I pass over to Lindy. So I think you'd need to be confident and clear about what you want, but without overwhelming with demands. So by that I mean you want to be kind of getting clear about the few things that are really important to you, rather than going into with a list of 20 things that are important to you. Being really clear again at that level of belief that this is the right thing for your child and you don't need to be in a begging kind of mode. Modelling a solution focus, and sharing in very simple or straightforward ways what will work for your child. And transferring information over time rather than thinking you have to hand over every report that was ever written on your child. The chances are that those reports will actually not be very informative about what the school needs to do to support your child well, and instead I would really encourage you to take charge of that information. And then to really see this as the start of building a relationship and being very warm and encouraging, and showing yourself as someone who is easy to work with. And that may seem really obvious, but actually sometimes we can come across as kind of prickly or like a scared rabbit because of how anxiety provoking the transition point is. So I'm actually not going to talk about that one because we don't have time, but you will see that when you come through. And I'm going to pass over to Lindy.
Okay, so I'm going to go through tips for preparing for prep entry, high school, year to year. So specifically more skills associated with the transition points. So first of all, sharing your child's strengths, what they're learning, their contributions. Sharing your vision and practice sharing it before. Don't have it the first time that you actually share it be the conversation with the school. Make sure that this is just part of your everyday ordinary language about your child. Talk to friends, all of your family members, have all of your family talk about the person with a disability that way, and they will also talk about themselves like that. Be careful what you ask for. So beware of unintended consequences of obviously leading with questions about support or therapists or stuff like that. So talk less about hours of support, more about what helps your child learn and feel safe. So think adjustments, think just more typical ordinary things that definitely keep your child engaged and feeling comfortable in their classroom space and in the playground, rather than hours of teacher aid time. Ask about the goal of support and reasonable adjustments, and habits of withdrawal or segregation. So always think about the outcomes likely to come from certain approaches and conversations that you start. So you can end up with an outcome of more independence for your child, more confidence, a feeling of belonging to the prep class, or different conversations could end up with an increased likelihood to have your child accompanied by an adult support, being a bit separate to the class. So think about the conversations that you start with. Prep is about fun and friendships, which is what Lisa said before, and don't let your child miss out on that. Don't you miss out on that. And get to know families, get to know the other kids in the class. Make that your priority above all. We have a couple of great quotes from two parents whose children are in prep this year. So they've gone through the process just last year about trying to find a school. And The first quote is this: "Our local school hose told me that they would not give Matt more than 5 hours support a week and that we should put him in a special school, even though he did not meet the criteria. Fortunately, our experience at another school was completely different. The principal asked a lot of questions about our expectations. He reassured us that he would seek the funding to ensure they met their educational obligations and my son's personal support needs, and they would try their very best to meet all of Matt's needs. There have been a few little things during his prep year, but they've been addressed and corrected immediately. I couldn't be happier with the school." So I always think that's very interesting and something to reflect on. This is the same child, but two different schools, two different school experiences. So it's always good to think about why that difference happens. Another quote from another mum. "For us or me, the most important thing for Oscar's inclusive education is that all the staff, teachers, aides, principals, etc., presume capacity, know about reasonable adjustments and have adequate training in best practice school community inclusion. The difference between the first school we spoke to and our current school is that the first kept saying, 'We aren't saying no, but we need you to understand we can't provide the support required to make adjustments and provide inclusion for your son.' The current school has been welcoming. They are willing to learn, willing to adjust, and willing to allocate funding to provide an inclusive educational journey." So, providing the support and adjustments for all diverse learners is a legal requirement of every school, as Lisa said. A lack of resources does get put to parents quite often as being a reason not to welcome or include a child. But parents who have ever included their child right through the school career in a regular school would say that the most valuable resource that exists is that willingness to collaborate and have a great relationship with parents who recognise that natural authority of parents in knowing their child, who care about what the child wants and aren't limiting in their expectations. It's very much down to that usual saying, where there is the will, there is the way. So if a school is willing to include, they often find the way on very little money if necessary. There we go. So this is another lovely quote to help us reflect about what we ask for. Mother of John, age 7, says, "In the beginning, I thought my son needed withdrawal for one-on-one or lots of aid time, but now I see how those things took him away from his peers. While there is still sometimes extra adult support in the class, there are many other ways to foster my son's participation, learning and belonging, so he is a full and valued class member." So I like to remember that I grew up in a time of integration. So and many of you will probably join me in remembering that there were children with disability being brought into my school, but they tended to just come along with an adult support person, and that was sort of the strategy of the day of integration, of just simply putting children with disability into a regular school, but there was very much that feeling that they were a visitor. So we need to question our own mindset when we are asking for things as parents for our own children. We are in a different time. Inclusion is very different to integration. And if we want the benefits of an inclusive education, then we do need to reflect on, there is just so much more information out there now. There's a lot of passionate educationalists who speak a lot of different strategies. So tap into that as parents and keep pushing forward for better inclusion. So tips for moving to high school. Now this is a time when the leap to high school can seem very scary, and many more people do find special school is presented as best. So this is a time to renew your vision, trust in your child, remember that they will continue to develop and grow. That is a very old idea, that because you have a disability you don't keep growing and developing. You know your child is going to continue to grow. So believe in the possibilities of them being in a regular high school. You know your child better now because well, they're older, you've been through primary school, you know the things that have worked, you know their strengths and their interests and what they love to do. So that's all really valuable information. Don't let the primary and high school plan the transition without you and your child, because that's information that they all need to plan the transition. Your child is also learning to advocate for themselves at this time, so involve them more and do claim your natural authority. Watch unhelpful assumptions, like a focus on life skills. Spell out your expectations. Are that you want full access to the full curriculum, like every child. Schools can assume that you just want sort of physical inclusion, but not necessarily social or academic inclusion. So it's really important to have that one-page profile. When you think about how much parent involvement and communication there is in high school, or how many kids teachers will see in a school day in a high school, it's really important to have that one-page profile so you have a really clear vision, so that everyone knows, even the relief teachers who come in for the day, know what the purpose is for your child being there, that he is to learn or she is to learn to be included fully. Culture will determine the best ways to get the outcomes you want, and who you should speak to and how. Right, so here is a really great quote from a mum of a high school student with a disability. She says, "High school seems scary at first, but has brought all the same amazing benefits and highlights for my daughter as it did for her older sister. Different teachers for different subjects, being surrounded by teenagers, talking about teenage stuff, have all brought on great growth and independence in our girl. Going into high school, I was a better advocate," and don't underestimate that you are a better advocate when you've been through primary school. That's a lot of years under your belt. "We are really seeing wonderful opportunities opening up because of the work we've put into including her in a regular school community." So questions to ask when you're looking at a high school: are classes streamed or mixed ability? Will your child be offered the same subject choices, regular classes and timetable? Will your child be segregated for any part of the school day, and where? And what is the model of support? So do be cautious about ideas of children with disability being automatically placed in a lower group. So that's to do with the streaming. Research is on the side of mixed ability classes. Children learn best in an idea-rich and communication-rich environment when they're surrounded by great role models. And of course, always ask for the regular classes for your child. Be intentional about that. You don't want your child's opportunities limited by a diagnosis, and because in high school there are so many teachers coming in contact with your child, it's hard to know what assumptions they will be carrying. So do be clear on that. An over-reliance on adult support, particularly in high school in the teenage years, can create a stigmatising perception amongst peers, but also for the child about themselves. So do be mindful of that. Keep working towards your vision of independence, being an independent learner, being socially included. Looking for valued roles and being intentional about that in high school is really important. Right from the start, setting up a way of making sure your child has a role like as a club member, to do with something that they have strengths or interests in. Even could be a set artist for a musical, PowerPoint creator. Give them things, great jobs and roles to have in the school. So, and that way also it's a great way to actually meet other children with similar interests. Year-to-year transitions. So every year, I think anyone who has been through for in school for a few years knows that every year can be very different. So always making sure that you're very clear with your vision from year to year is important. You will always find allies in your school and foster those relationships. So even when you do have a bit of a tricky year, a year that perhaps the teacher is not as naturally assuming of the competence of your child, or has the high expectations or the confidence to include your child academically, then you can draw on the experience and wisdom of other teachers. Teachers who are supporters of your child tend to also see your child as having strengths, know how to get the best out of your child, and will often be very willing to share that in teacher speak with other teachers. So foster those relationships. And finally, moving schools, which does happen from time to time, moving from one school to another, and including special to regular school. We know families, and the CRU has a rich history of stories of families who have pursued inclusion because it is never too early or too late for their child. Seeing is believing, so connecting with peer support is extremely important. Often parents are inspired because they've seen children who they consider having very similar support requirements to their own child, living and working in a regular ordinary school and loving it and being surrounded by a great school community. So that's often the inspiration that a family needs. Asking about what support the department could provide is important, but remember, it is your child's right to be there. Preparing a script to negotiate any barriers or negatives that are expressed to you by family members, by staff. Remember, it can feel like you're pushing against the grain. I am also, in my voluntary capacity, I am a member of the Queensland Collective for Inclusive Education, and we do provide peer support, and you can see the website at qcie.org. So in summary, lead with your vision and gifts, not problems. Be careful what you ask for. Learn about inclusive practices. Remember, resist the integration ideas. Making inclusion work in the class or finding resources is not your responsibility, so don't apologise. Your job is to advocate for your child. There's many resources out there, and many passionate, inclusive educationalists who would be willing to share. Share knowledge of your child in a warm, non-confrontational but assertive way. So don't be scared, don't be aggressive. Try and find that balance. And finally, this is a quote from a mother who did step out in belief in her child and moved her child from a special school to a regular school. And she says, "I persevered, determined to learn more to see how inclusion was possible because my conscience wouldn't allow me not to. When Kate's siblings asked why Kate went to a different school, every answer I gave felt weak and untruthful. I was compromising the right of all my children to experience their schooling years together. Now, when all three walk through the same school gates together in the same uniform, it is a powerful feeling of completeness."
Great. Thank you, Lindy. And we have kind of rushed through there. So to remind you about how to find the chat and to move the mouse to the bottom of the screen. I just wanted to say, I skipped over one thing, which was really, I know it is an anxiety-provoking time, but I actually think it's really important that you don't whip yourself up into a frenzy of anxiety. And that's because that's not really going to be helpful, and that sometimes we can transmit as parents our own anxiety onto our kids. So we actually need to build their confidence. And also that can, as Lindy mentioned before, connecting with peer support can make us feel more confident. So we might need to talk through those fears and doubts, but probably not with the school and not with our kids. And to remember that the transition is about entry into a school community. So sometimes we can focus a lot on just the school leadership or professionals, but actually connecting with other parents and helping our kids know some other students in that school is a really worthwhile investment of your time. We are going to be also sending out some links to some Department of Education resources on transition and copies of our fact sheets. And so I would encourage anyone to come to us with any more of their questions over the next couple of days and weeks, and want to just acknowledge the funding support of the Department of Education. So thanks for your participation, and we will also be sending out a survey to see whether the workshop has been, to what extent this webinar has met your expectations. Farewell, have a good evening, bye bye.